In the basement of the Tennessee State Library, there hangs a family tree unlike any other. At first glance, it looks like a mistake. Lines looping back on themselves, names repeating across generations in impossible patterns. But it isn't a mistake. It's a record of the Coulter clan, the most inbred bloodline ever documented in American history. At the center of it all was one man, Ezekiel Coulter. Born in 1889, he retreated deep into the Appalachian wilderness, where he built an isolated compound and declared himself patriarch, prophet, and ruler. For more than 40 years, he engineered his own twisted bloodline, binding sons to cousins, fathers to grandsons, until the family tree collapsed into a genetic labyrinth. When outsiders finally stumbled upon the compound, what they found defied both science and morality. Children who were brothers and uncles at the same time. Sons who had no way of knowing where fatherhood ended and grandfatherhood began. Before we unravel this disturbing history, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and share this with someone who loves untold stories. It helps us bring you more deep dives like this one, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss what's coming next. The chart filled an entire wall in the basement archive, a spider's web of inked lines twisting, doubling back, and looping over itself until it resembled less a family record and more a nightmare. Archivists who stumbled upon it thought surely it had been misfiled, some eccentric's scribble mistakenly stored among Tennessee's preserved histories. But as they traced each branch, the realization struck. This was real, deliberate, and devastatingly accurate. Every name was connected twice, sometimes 3 times to another. A son became his own uncle, a father turned into a grandfather through a single child, bloodlines collapsing inward like an implosion. At the center of this chaos was a single name, written with steady hand, Ezekiel Coulter. He wasn't just one figure among many, he was the axis. Dozens of lines led back to him again and again. To modern eyes, the chart looks like madness incarnate. But for decades, it was the unbroken record of one family's hidden reality, carefully maintained by state officials after its discovery in the early 1950s. Imagine the shock of the first man to stumble onto this truth. He thought he was investigating a health outbreak in the mountains, yet instead he found the most tangled family tree ever recorded. His name was Robert Hayes, a state inspector accustomed to backroads, illness reports, and poverty-stricken cabins. But he had never faced a mystery like this, one that redefined what family could even mean. The day he first encountered the Coulter settlement, Hayes was struck by the silence. Cabins stood intact, smoke faintly rising, but the place felt wrong, like a camp frozen in some private ritual. When the first boys emerged, their appearance unsettled him instantly. Not just the ragged clothes or the underfed frames, but their movements, hesitant and uncertain, as though the simple act of greeting was foreign. Hayes questioned them gently at first. Their answers came muddled, their words twisted by strange pronunciation, and most troubling, their claims of being brothers, cousins, and sons all at once. The logic collapsed quickly. What Hayes didn't yet know was that he'd uncovered the physical embodiment of the chart stored decades later in Nashville. These weren't rumors or exaggerations. They were flesh and blood evidence of Ezekiel's legacy. When authorities finally mapped the connections, the results staggered even trained genealogists. The same man appearing as father, grandfather, and great-grandfather to boys barely a decade apart in age. A labyrinth without exit. To a researcher, the tree was data. To the state, a scandal. But to the children, those boys stumbling in confusion, it was reality. They had no other frame of reference for kinship. The more Hayes pressed, the clearer the pattern became. These were not distant cousins marrying in isolation. This was deliberate, enforced, a system that had been nurtured and hidden for generations. The discovery rattled through official channels. Doctors, historians, archivists all struggled to process what had been unearthed. And yet, even then, much of the truth was sealed away, deemed too disturbing for general release. The Coulter family tree eventually hung in archives not as a curiosity, but as a warning, a chart that dared anyone who looked upon it to imagine the lives lived beneath its twisted branches. For every line inked on paper, there was a boy growing up without clarity of who his father truly was. For every connection looped back, there was confusion, loss, and genetic damage embodied. Thus, the forgotten tree earned its name, not because it was ignored, but because it represented a history most preferred to leave unspoken. Yet its presence remains, hanging like a shadow over Tennessee's past. Ezekiel Coulter's arrival in Tennessee remains a mystery wrapped in speculation. He drifted into the Cumberland Gap around 1910, a wiry young man with no family, no papers, and a pocket full of unexplained cash. Locals whispered he might have fled trouble from another state, perhaps abandoning a name or crime. Whatever his past, he carried with him an uncanny knowledge of livestock breeding that unsettled seasoned mountain farmers. He purchased 200 acres of steep mountain land with cash, an impossible feat for a 21-year-old drifter. No mortgage, no relatives to vouch for him, just a sudden stake in the wilderness. The land was carefully chosen. Narrow dirt roads wound through deep forests and across creeks that flooded each winter, sealing off travelers. His valley was a natural fortress, both concealed and defensible. The first cabin he built was stark and practical. No painted trim, no neighbors invited. He raised its logs with his own hands, chopping and shaping until the structure stood like a fortress of solitude. Men living nearby noted his self-sufficiency. He traded little, spoke less, and often vanished for weeks, hunting or studying alone in the hills. Ezekiel was a presence, not a participant, in mountain society. When asked about his past, he answered vaguely. Sometimes his surname shifted. Sometimes he hinted at heritage tied to preachers, soldiers, or farmers. He seemed to rebuild himself with every conversation, never truly anchored. In town, he kept to necessities: flour, salt, tools, never luxuries. His demeanor carried both discipline and suspicion, a man guarding secrets. Folks quickly learned not to ask questions he wasn't willing to answer. By the early 1920s, he had expanded the homestead into a compound. Additional cabins appeared, aligned with deliberate precision, connected by covered walkways that allowed movement unseen from the single-approach road. Ezekiel preached to his sons about purity and discipline. His teachings mixed scraps of scripture with lessons from breeding manuals, weaving a philosophy that elevated bloodline preservation above all moral or social norms. He insisted that the outside world was corrupt and weakening. According to him, true strength came from within one's own line, an idea that took root in the isolation of the valley. Neighbors began noticing his absence from community gatherings. He stopped attending church, refused barn raisings, and declined trade fairs. Ezekiel was severing every tie that could connect his compound to outside authority. Inside the valley, discipline grew harsher. The boys rose with dawn, labored through daylight, and studied passages by lantern light. His rules were absolute, his word law, his punishments swift and unyielding. Ezekiel cultivated silence as much as obedience. The boys learned not to question, not to wander, not to dream of life beyond the ridges. Curiosity was dangerous. Loyalty was survival. The compound itself mirrored his philosophy. Workshops for blacksmithing, storage for grain, pens for animals, all organized with precision. Even a crude infirmary emerged, where he practiced medicine through knowledge stolen from veterinary guides. From outside, it looked like any struggling homestead. But within, Ezekiel was engineering a world designed for control, secrecy, and self-reliance. Every plank hammered, every path cleared, reinforced his authority. The hills became both prison and kingdom. Ezekiel ruled unchallenged, molding sons into disciples and shaping an isolated dynasty that owed allegiance to no law, no neighbor, no tradition but his own. In the silence of the Appalachians, his vision solidified. What began as a drifter's escape grew into a fortress of conviction. Ezekiel Coulter was no longer just a settler. He was a patriarch enthroned. Within the compound, Ezekiel's authority deepened. He preached a doctrine he called the covenant, a rigid system of obedience built on silence, loyalty, and fear. To his sons, he was not just father, he was chosen patriarch. The covenant began with words, long evenings around the fire where Ezekiel recited passages bent to his own design. He declared the outside world poisoned, its families weak, its traditions unworthy of survival. His sons absorbed these teachings as truth. Having never known freedom beyond the ridges, they saw no alternative. Their universe was bounded by trees, cabins, and the voice of their father. Silence became sacred. Speaking doubts was forbidden. Asking questions risked punishment. Every boy learned quickly that loyalty meant holding secrets tighter than breath itself, swallowing uncertainty and replacing it with reverence for Ezekiel. He trained them in labor as much as in doctrine. Fields were worked by hand, cabins repaired by collective effort. Discipline hardened their bodies, but it also crushed independence, forging submission through repetition. The covenant demanded that brothers guard one another's loyalty. If one faltered, all bore the punishment. This ensured mutual surveillance. Suspicion became as constant as the wind moving through the valley's ridges. At meals, prayers blended scripture with Ezekiel's decrees. Food was scarce, yet ritual was abundant. Every bowl of beans or corn was accompanied by words binding the family tighter to their father's vision. Ezekiel positioned himself as both patriarch and prophet. He insisted he had divine sanction to reorder kinship, to purify lineage. For boys starved of comparison, his claims carried weight that reason alone could not break. Some resisted quietly. A younger son once questioned why they couldn't visit neighboring farms. Ezekiel's hand silenced him with bruises. After that, no one voiced such doubts aloud again. The covenant thrived on fear as much as reverence. Each act of rebellion, real or imagined, was met with spectacle, a whipping, isolation, withheld meals. These moments reminded every boy of the cost of defiance. Yet in Ezekiel's presence, tenderness sometimes surfaced. He spoke of destiny, of their family's strength, of building a line unbroken by weakness. His sons, desperate for approval, clung to these rare affirmations. Isolation deepened their dependence. Without friends, mentors, or outside kin, the boys had no counterbalance. Ezekiel's word filled every silence, his rules stretched across every hour. The covenant swallowed childhood and redefined it. The boys developed their own dialect, shaped by Ezekiel's sermons and isolation. Strange words emerged, twisted pronunciations, invented phrases. Language itself became another wall, separating them further from the world beyond the ridges. Visitors were rare, but when they came, hunters lost in the hills or traders passing through, the family stayed hidden. Ezekiel spoke for them all, his sons instructed never to reveal what lay within. Punishments for speaking out of turn grew legendary among them. One boy left a note scratched on wood, dreaming of escape. Ezekiel discovered it. The beating that followed silenced dreams for years. Despite the pain, bonds between brothers ran deep. They suffered together, carried timber together, whispered in shadows when courage allowed. Ezekiel's rule bound them, but it also forged unspoken loyalty among themselves. The covenant endured because Ezekiel convinced them it was eternal. He told them generations would honor his vision, that their silence and loyalty would outlast even the mountains surrounding their valley fortress. By the 1930s, the covenant of silence was no longer merely a doctrine. It was the marrow of their existence, an iron code etched into every heart, leaving no room for disobedience or escape. As years passed, the second generation of Coulter boys grew into manhood within the compound. Yet their understanding of kinship had already been warped by Ezekiel's teachings, where boundaries blurred and family ties folded inward. The boys, raised under his covenant, accepted his decrees as sacred law. They believed purity came only through their own blood, and Ezekiel ensured no thought of seeking partners beyond the compound survived. What resulted was a collapse of identity. Sons became uncles to children not much younger than themselves. Brothers were also fathers. Grandsons were indistinguishable from nephews. Language itself strained under the weight of tangled roles. Medical consequences soon appeared. Children born from these unions carried visible marks, crooked spines, crossed eyes, and slowed development. Yet within the compound, these signs were reinterpreted as divine favor, proof of chosen blood. The boys were taught that their ailments, their brothers' struggles, were not curses but symbols of endurance. Ezekiel convinced them hardship was proof of superiority, that survival through weakness meant spiritual strength. Each generation further distorted the tree. A son might also be his own cousin, while a grandson stood simultaneously as great-nephew. Genealogists later struggled to diagram relationships that defied even scientific description. By the mid-1940s, Ezekiel had bound 3 full generations to his system. Some boys were raised calling him father, others grandfather, yet all were equally subject to his iron control and distorted authority. Isolation preserved the cycle. There were no teachers, no doctors, no elders beyond Ezekiel himself. The boys had no examples outside their valley, no models of what family life might normally look like. When a child died, as many did, the grave was unmarked, hidden among pines. Brothers dug silently, lowering the small body without ceremony. Death was routine, grief muted, survival the only lesson. Despite tragedy, life inside pressed onward. The compound grew crowded with cabins, filled with boys and young men who knew only one law: loyalty to Ezekiel, even as their bloodlines fractured under his design. Some displayed alarming impairments: speech slurred, movements jerky, minds slower to grasp. Still they labored in fields, recited passages, and lived under the same covenant. Their worth measured not by health, but obedience. Brothers began fathering children who were also their cousins. The tree collapsed inward like a knot tightening. Each birth compounded the entanglement, drawing Ezekiel deeper into a lineage that no longer resembled natural family. Whispers arose in private moments between brothers. Questions lingered about why they suffered deformities while outsiders did not. Yet fear smothered rebellion. No one dared voice doubt openly, not under Ezekiel's relentless gaze. The compound's dialect thickened into something incomprehensible to strangers. Boys spoke half scripture, half invented words. Their speech mirrored their bloodlines, tangled, looping, a language only they could understand, unintelligible beyond their ridges. By the time investigators later documented the tree, they found not just broken bodies, but broken categories of kinship. The roles of father, son, uncle, cousin, all collapsed into meaningless repetition. The boys themselves saw nothing strange. To them, this was life: working fields, chanting verses, obeying Ezekiel. Their bonds were tangled, but they had no measure to see how far they'd strayed. Bloodlines entangled, identities shattered, and generations stacked upon one another until even Ezekiel's own place in the tree became confusing. He was patriarch, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather all at once. And still, the covenant held. March 1952 began like any other in the mountains. Cold winds curling through valleys, snowmelt swelling the creeks. Yet it was during this season that the outside world would finally breach Ezekiel's fortress of silence. Robert Hayes, a state health inspector, was traveling rough back roads to investigate rumors of tuberculosis. His truck stalled miles from any settlement, forcing him to walk the narrow trails leading deeper into the Cumberland Gap. What he stumbled upon first looked abandoned. Weathered cabins, fences sagging, smoke thin in the air. But subtle signs betrayed habitation, worn paths, footprints in mud, faint movement behind shuttered windows. Someone lived here. Hayes approached cautiously. Then a boy emerged, awkward in gait, eyes darting nervously. His clothing was torn, his frame frail. He spoke words that sounded familiar, yet strange, laced with unusual rhythms and inflections. The boy claimed to be both brother and nephew to another child. Hayes froze at the contradiction. But before he could clarify, more boys appeared, each repeating bewildering claims of overlapping kinship. Their bodies bore troubling signs, limps, twisted spines, slack expressions. Yet their reverence toward Ezekiel, who soon stepped from the cabin, was unmistakable. They bowed heads, speaking his name like prayer and command entwined. Ezekiel presented himself as patriarch of a devout household. His words carried authority, calm yet unyielding. He explained their isolation as spiritual necessity, insisting they lived separate to preserve strength against outside corruption. Hayes listened, unsettled. He noticed boys lingering behind Ezekiel, whispering to each other, watching with equal parts fear and awe. The compound radiated secrecy, but also discipline too rigid to be natural. For 2 hours, Hayes observed carefully. The dialect, the deformed children, the impossibly tangled relationships, all pointed to something larger than illness. This was not simply poverty. This was generational collapse hidden in plain sight. When he returned to town, Hayes knew he couldn't let it go. He filed urgent reports, describing not just medical risks, but alarming evidence of abuse, neglect, and a family structure beyond comprehension. 3 days later, he returned with county officials and a physician. This time, the compound couldn't hide. Boys crowded the cabins, their impairments laid bare, their confusion about kinship echoing through every answer given. Officials documented what they saw. Children unable to walk steadily, others with crossed eyes or hearing loss, some incapable of forming clear sentences. Many shrank from outsiders, clinging desperately to Ezekiel's presence. The physician took notes frantically, recognizing signs of inbreeding so severe they bordered on unprecedented. What shocked him most wasn't only the deformities, but the boy's conviction that this was normal, ordained, righteous. Investigators pushed deeper, uncovering graves hidden in pine groves. Small mounds marked with stones revealed the extent of losses. Each represented a child who hadn't survived the compound's entangled bloodlines or denied medical care. Still, Ezekiel stood firm. He told officials his family was chosen, purified by trials. His authority over the compound was absolute. Even in chains of suspicion, his voice commanded his son's unwavering loyalty. For authorities, the breaking point had been reached. No longer could secrecy protect the Coulters. The investigation widened, records gathered, witnesses called. What emerged was a scandal poised to shock Tennessee and eventually the nation. The day Hayes's truck failed on that mountain road became the moment history finally caught up with Ezekiel Coulter. His carefully hidden world of silence and bloodlines could no longer remain sealed in shadows. The collapse of Ezekiel Coulter's compound in 1952 sent shockwaves far beyond the ridges. What investigators uncovered was unlike anything documented in American history. A lineage collapsing inward, and a patriarch's iron rule finally fractured. 37 living descendants were taken into custody, ranging from infants to grown men in their 30s. Each bore scars of isolation, crooked spines, dulled eyes, hesitant speech, and confusion over even the simplest family terms. Doctors quickly realized the damage went beyond the physical. Many boys struggled to understand concepts like uncle, cousin, or grandfather. Roles blurred so completely that identity itself had dissolved inside Ezekiel's labyrinth. Ezekiel was arrested under charges of incest and endangerment. Yet his age and failing health limited punishment. He served only 3 years before dying in 1955, leaving behind a twisted legacy more enduring than his life. His death certificate listed him simultaneously as father, grandfather, and great-grandfather to dozens of boys. A record so bizarre, officials debated how to file it within normal bureaucratic categories. It defied definition itself. Surviving sons and grandsons were scattered into institutions and foster homes. Many could not adapt. Some required lifelong care. Others struggled with basic independence, haunted by memories of loyalty and fear drilled into childhood. For them, freedom was disorienting. The outside world felt alien, its language strange, its customs unfamiliar. They had lived entire lives under one man's doctrine, and now that doctrine was stripped away overnight. Medical research teams documented every detail. Geneticists, psychiatrists, and historians gathered data, studying the Coulter clan as a cautionary example of what isolation and unchecked authority could do to bloodlines and human dignity. Reports described inbreeding coefficients approaching theoretical limits of survival. Over half the boys displayed severe cognitive impairment. Many were partially deaf, blind, or physically malformed. Generations of collapse had nearly extinguished the line. Portions of these findings were sealed for decades. Officials feared public release would cause uproar, both for its disturbing details and for the failure of authorities to detect the compound sooner. Silence lingered long. The property itself was seized by the state. By 1960, the cabins were demolished, leaving only a cemetery of unmarked graves where many Coulter boys, victims of their patriarch's experiment, still rested beneath pine needles. Researchers continued visiting the site for years, treating it as a grim classroom. The Coulter case shaped policies for monitoring isolated communities, underscoring the dangers of secrecy, coercion, and obsession with controlling bloodlines. Yet beyond science, the story carried human weight. Brothers who once whispered dreams of escape never found peace. Sons who knew no world beyond Ezekiel's word spent lifetimes struggling with loss and confusion. Archivists preserved the family tree in Nashville's State Library. To this day, it hangs under restricted access, a visual labyrinth of loops and overlaps, every line tracing the destruction wrought by one man's will. For those who see it, the chart delivers a chilling message. Every stroke of ink represents boys who lived under tyranny, whose identities dissolved, whose very bodies bore the price of silence. The Coulter story endures not because people want to remember it, but because forgetting risks repetition. It remains a testament to how secrecy and control can twist a family into something unrecognizable. Ezekiel Coulter's compound is gone, his bloodline scattered, but the shadow remains. A cautionary tale carved into history, reminding us that unchecked power, when left to grow in isolation, always leaves ashes behind.